I was already wearing my wedding dress when my mother handed me her phone. That is the image I keep coming back to. Ivory silk charmeuse, buttons up the spine that my maid of honor had fastened one by one that morning while we drank champagne and cried the good kind of tears. My veil, my shoes, my bouquet of white ranunculus and dusty Miller sitting on the hotel dresser behind me, and my mother, Diane Acaffer, holding out her phone with the expression of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. I did not scream, I did not throw anything. I did not crumple to the floor the way you might expect a bride to crumple when she is told, 47 minutes before her ceremony, that the venue has been canceled. I took the phone. I read the email from the Grand Bellevue Hotel confirming that the reservation had been released at the request of Gerald Acaffer, my father. I handed the phone back to my mother. I walked to the desk in the corner of the bridal suite, opened my laptop, and I pulled up the document I had been quietly building for the past 14 months. Then I printed the invoice, $427,000, written out in full, line by line, every vendor, every deposit, every non-refundable fee that was going to evaporate before the afternoon was over. I signed the bottom. I dated it. And then I walked downstairs in my wedding dress and handed it to both of my parents in the lobby of the hotel while 83 guests who had traveled from 4 different states waited in a ballroom that was about to be dark. Some people still say I went too far. My father has not spoken to me in 11 months. My sister, Renata Acaffer Blaine, told anyone who would listen that I was heartless, that I chose money over family, that I had turned a tragedy into a performance. Nobody has called me a liar, though, not one person, not once. I want you to hear everything. Because to understand what happened in that hotel lobby, you have to understand what the 14 months before it looked like. And to understand those 14 months, you have to go back even further to the family I grew up in and the particular way my parents had of loving their daughters very differently. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with me today. I genuinely appreciate every single one of you. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you are watching from. I have people tuning in from everywhere, and it means more than I can say. My name is Zora Acaffer Mensah. I am 38 years old. I am the older daughter of Gerald and Diane Acaffer, a couple who have been married for 41 years and who, for the entirety of my conscious life, conducted their household according to a set of rules nobody ever wrote down but everybody understood. Renata was the priority. Renata was the one who needed protecting, who needed advocating for, who needed whatever the family had available at any given moment. And I was the one who was fine. I was always fine. Being fine was my assigned role, the way some children and families are assigned to be the responsible one or the funny one or the peacemaker. I was the fine one, the one who did not need anything because she could handle everything herself. I want to be fair here because I believe in being fair even when it is hard. My sister is not a monster. She's not evil in the way that villains in stories are evil. She's something more ordinary and in some ways more difficult to explain. She is a person who grew up believing that she was the center of the universe because the two most important people in her world confirmed it for her every single day. My parents did not create a cruel daughter on purpose. They created a daughter who never learned that other people's needs were as real as her own. And then they spent the rest of their lives managing the consequences of that, which always seemed to involve pulling resources from me and directing them toward her. I want to be clear about who I am professionally because it matters to the story. I am a licensed structural engineer. I run my own consulting firm, Mensah Acaffer Engineering Group, which I founded 6 years ago after spending 8 years at a larger firm. We do infrastructure assessment and design, mostly municipal contracts and commercial construction oversight. I employ 11 people. In the year my wedding was canceled, my firm grossed just over $2.1 million. I tell you this not to impress you, but because one of the central lies of my family's narrative was that I was the daughter who needed to be taken care of, who could not manage on her own, who had to be grateful for every scrap of parental support tossed in my direction. I had not needed financial support from my parents since I was 24 years old. My sister Renata, who is 34, has needed it continuously and substantially since she was 18. That is not a judgment. That is just the arithmetic of our family. Renata has 2 daughters from her marriage to David Blaine, which ended in a divorce that was, by every account including her own, deeply acrimonious. Her daughters are 8 and 11 years old. The custody arrangement they negotiated after the divorce was fragile from the beginning, and by the time my wedding was 14 months out, it had become a full legal war. David Blaine had filed for primary custody. He had a good attorney. He had documentation of things Renata had done that were, at minimum, not going to look favorable in front of a family court judge. I do not know the complete truth of what happened in Renata's marriage. I know her version and I know fragments of David's version, and I know that the reality is almost certainly somewhere between the two. What I know with certainty is that by the spring before my wedding, my parents had decided that Renata's custody battle was the family's primary emergency and that every resource available needed to be directed toward it, including, it would turn out, the resources they had promised to help fund for my wedding. Let me back up to where this actually begins. Not the custody battle, not the wedding. The beginning is a Sunday dinner in October, 2 years before my wedding was supposed to happen, when my mother made an announcement that I should have paid more attention to. My fiance, Tobias Mensah, and I had been together for 4 years at that point. We had recently gotten engaged. It was still new and shining, and I was embarrassingly happy about it. We went to my parents' house for dinner the Sunday after we got engaged, and my mother made her roast chicken and her groundnut soup, and my father opened a bottle of wine he had been saving, and it felt for about 40 minutes like a genuinely warm family celebration. Then Renata arrived late, which was not unusual, with her daughters in tow, which was also not unusual, and she sat down and within 10 minutes had redirected the entire conversation to her own situation. Her divorce proceedings, her attorney fees. The fact that David was being unreasonable and she needed more documentation, and her lawyer had quoted her a figure that was making her feel sick. My mother reached across the table and covered Renata's hand with hers. That gesture, I had seen it so many times. There was something about watching it that night, the night of my engagement dinner, that sat in my chest like a stone. My father cleared his throat. He looked at me and Tobias. He said that they were so happy for us, that Tobias was a wonderful man, and that they wanted to help with the wedding in whatever way they could. Then he said that things were a bit tight at the moment because of Renata's situation, and they hoped we would understand. I smiled. I said of course we understood completely. Tobias squeezed my hand under the table. Later that night, driving home, he asked me how I was feeling. I told him I was fine. I said it without thinking because that is what I had been trained to say for 36 years. Then I stopped myself because Tobias is the kind of man who actually waits for a real answer, and I said, I think I already know how this wedding is going to go. I think we should plan it as though we are paying for everything ourselves and treat anything my parents contribute as a bonus. He nodded. He said that sounded wise. That was the beginning of my approach, not anger, not confrontation. Just a quiet recalibration of expectations. I did not yet know I would need anything more than that. I did not yet know that my parents were not simply going to be less helpful than I hoped. I did not yet know that they were going to actively dismantle something I had spent months building, but I am getting ahead of myself. Because first, the year and a half before the wedding was mostly ordinary disappointments, the kind you talk yourself out of because every family has friction, every family has complicated dynamics, and you do not want to be the person who makes everything about herself. I had watched Renata make everything about herself for 3 decades, and I had no interest in becoming that. In the spring of the year before my wedding, my parents sat me down and told me they had decided to contribute $30,000 toward the wedding costs. My mother presented this with considerable ceremony, like she was announcing a philanthropic grant. She talked about how much they believed in Tobias and me, how much they wanted the day to be special. My father nodded throughout. It was clearly something they had rehearsed. I thanked them genuinely. $30,000 was $30,000, and Tobias and I were managing the rest ourselves. The total wedding budget was approximately $90,000, which sounds like a lot until you factor in that we were hosting 112 guests, including my parents' entire social network, a full dinner reception, a live band, a venue that seated that many people comfortably, and all the associated costs that multiply faster than you expect when you actually start booking vendors. I will not bore you with every line of the budget. What matters is this: by the time I had signed contracts with the Grand Bellevue Hotel, the catering company, the florist, the photographer, the band, the transportation company, and the dozen other vendors required to produce a wedding of that size, I had paid out in non-refundable deposits and early payments just over $160,000 of Tobias's and my own money. And my parents had contributed exactly zero of their promised $30,000 because there was always a reason to wait another month. If you have ever been in a family where you are the one who is always fine, you know what that waiting feels like. It is not dramatic. Nobody yells. Nobody says anything outright cruel. It is just a series of conversations where something is almost addressed and then isn't, where a commitment is restated with slightly different wording, where you leave each interaction technically reassured and practically no further forward. You go home and you tell your fiancé that you think things are fine, and you both try to believe it. The deposits were paid. The venue was booked, the caterer was locked in, the band had a signed contract, the florist had sketched the arrangements. Tobias and I were 12 months out from our wedding date, and we were by every visible measure on track. I had no idea that 5 months earlier, my father had given my sister $62,000 for her attorney fees without telling me. I had no idea that they had promised her an additional $40,000 if the custody case went to a full trial. I had no idea that the $30,000 they had promised me had been sitting in my father's mind as a number that could be reassigned at need. I found out about the $62,000 in August, 8 months before the wedding, from my mother's friend Constance, who mentioned it casually at a family barbecue. clearly believing I already knew. She was talking about how wonderful Gerald and Diane were, how they had really stepped up for Renata, and she named the amount with the comfortable specificity of someone repeating something she had been told in confidence. I absorbed the information without moving. I think I nodded. I think I said something about how family takes care of family. Constance went to refill her plate, and I stood by the drinks table and very quietly calculated the arithmetic. My parents had given Renata $62,000. They had not yet given me a single dollar of the $30,000 they had promised. The wedding was 8 months away. I excused myself and went to the bathroom and sat on the edge of the bathtub for 4 minutes. Then I washed my hands, checked my face in the mirror, and went back out to the barbecue. I called my attorney the next morning. Her name is Priya Sunderland, and she had done some contract work for my firm. I had never needed her for anything personal before. I explained the situation, the verbal commitment, the timeline, the contracts I had signed in good faith, the discovery that money had been diverted to my sister. She listened without interrupting. Then she told me 3 things. First, verbal promises from parents regarding wedding contributions are not legally enforceable contracts. Second, if I wanted any protection, I needed to get the commitment in writing. Third, she said, keep documenting everything from this point forward. I drove home from that call and I opened a new document on my laptop. I titled it simply with the date. I typed in everything I remembered from the previous 18 months, every conversation about wedding support, every promise made, every delay, every piece of information I had received about money given to Renata. I saved it to a secure cloud folder that I shared only with Priya. That document became the foundation of the invoice, but I did not know that yet. At that point, I was still hoping none of it would be necessary. I was still trying to believe that my family would come through. She told me to be realistic. I called my attorney the next morning. That, I have come to understand, is the distance between the person I was before that August barbecue and the person I became after it. The betrayal that actually broke my capacity for wishful thinking did not happen until November. That is the one I want to tell you about now, because everything that followed grew directly out of that afternoon. It was a Saturday in mid-November, 7 months before the wedding. Tobias and I had driven to my parents' house for what my mother had described as a family lunch. She said she wanted to go over some wedding details, talk through the plan, make sure everything was on track. I want you to understand how much I wanted to believe that, how consciously I chose to walk into that house expecting good faith. The table was set when we arrived. My mother had made jollof rice and fried plantains and a whole baked fish, which is her version of a special occasion meal. Renata was already there, which I noted but did not comment on. Her daughters were in the backyard. My father was at the head of the table with the particular posture he gets when he is about to say something he has rehearsed. We sat down. My mother served. Nobody said anything about the wedding for the first 20 minutes. We talked about my niece's school. We talked about the weather. My father asked Tobias about a project he was working on. It was pleasant and slightly airless, the way conversations are when everyone at the table knows something is coming. Then my father put down his fork, folded his hands, and said that he and my mother needed to talk to us about something. He said that Renata's custody situation had reached a critical point. He said her attorney had advised that the case was likely going to trial, and that the trial was expected to be expensive and protracted. He said that as her parents, he and my mother had decided that they needed to prioritize her needs at this time. He paused. I looked at the fish on my plate. I was aware of a sound in my ears that was not quite ringing, just a kind of pressure. He said that the $30,000 they had promised toward the wedding was going to have to be redirected to Renata's legal fund. He said they were sorry, they knew this was not ideal, they hoped we would understand that this was a family emergency. He said he was sure we could manage. Renata looked at the table. She had the expression of someone who feels bad about something they are doing anyway. That I will give her. She was not gloating. She looked genuinely uncomfortable, which almost made it worse because gloating would have been easier to be angry at. My mother reached out and touched my hand. She said, "You are the strong one. You have always been able to manage. We need to be there for Renata right now. You understand that, don't you?" I looked at my mother's hand on mine. I thought about the $62,000 they had already given Renata without telling me. I thought about the $40,000 more they had apparently promised. I thought about the $160,000 of my own money that was already non-refundably committed to vendors who would not return deposits under any circumstances. I thought about Tobias sitting next to me, who had worked 70-hour weeks for 2 years to help us build toward this day. I said, of course. I understand completely. Let's make sure Renata has what she needs. My father's shoulders came down an inch. My mother squeezed my hand. Renata looked up from the table and gave me a smile that was small and relieved and I think genuine. Tobias said nothing. He put his hand on my knee under the table. I did not look at him because I knew if I looked at him, I would not be able to keep my voice steady. We finished lunch. We helped clear the table. We said our goodbyes. We drove for 11 minutes without speaking, and then I pulled off the road into a gas station parking lot and we sat there for a while. Tobias said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I want to know the exact number, everything we've spent, everything that is non-refundable, every contract, every vendor, every deposit." He nodded. I said, "And I want to know what they've given Renata, as much as I can find out." He asked if I was going to confront them. I thought about that for a long time. Then I said, "Not yet. Not until I know the full picture." He looked at me carefully. He said, "You already have a plan, don't you?" I said, "I'm working on one." He put the car in drive and pulled back onto the road, and I called Priya from the passenger seat and left her a message asking for an urgent meeting. I had the sensation, sitting in that car watching the familiar streets of my hometown slide past, of a door closing behind me on a version of myself who had still been waiting for things to be fair. That version of me was finished. What came next would not be about fairness. It would be about documentation, strategy, and the precise application of consequences. I want to tell you about the months that followed because what happened in November was just the first domino. In December, I hired a separate accountant, a woman named Felicia Tamura who specialized in personal financial forensics. I gave her everything I had, my own wedding expense records, the information I had gathered about the $62,000 given to Renata, and the timeline of my parents' promises. I was not trying to build a criminal case. I was trying to understand the complete financial picture so that when the moment came, I would have numbers that nobody could dispute. Felicia spent 3 weeks going through everything. She called me on a Wednesday morning in early January, 6 months before the wedding, and she had the tone of someone who has found something they did not entirely expect to find. She said that based on what she had been able to verify through documentation I had provided and a few other sources, my parents had directed a total of approximately $143,000 toward Renata's custody situation since the proceedings began. That included the $62,000 to the attorney, the $40,000 in promises that had been at least partially paid, and smaller amounts totaling roughly $41,000 that had gone to related expenses including a guardian ad litem, expert witness fees, and a period when Renata had temporarily moved into my parents' home and stopped paying her share of household costs, $143,000. I wrote the number down on a piece of paper and looked at it for a long time. I said, "And my wedding contribution?" Felicia said, "Based on the documentation you've shared with me, they have paid $0 toward your wedding." I thanked her. I added her report to the folder I shared with Priya. I went to my kitchen and made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window and thought about the fact that my parents had redirected $143,000 to my sister while telling me that $30,000 was too much to spare. I want to be careful here because I am aware of how this sounds. I am aware that a custody battle involving children, involving someone fighting to keep her daughters, is not the same as a wedding. I am not arguing that it is. I'm not saying my wedding was more important than my niece's well-being. What I am saying is that my parents made promises to me in the full knowledge of what those promises meant legally and financially, and they allowed me to sign contracts and commit my own money in reliance on those promises, while simultaneously directing enormous resources elsewhere without telling me. That is not a matter of priorities. That is a matter of honesty. And what I was about to discover in February would make the dishonesty even more specific than I had realized. February was 4 months before the wedding. Tobias and I had adjusted our budget, absorbed the loss of the promised $30,000, and were managing. We were not comfortable, but we were managing. The vendors were paid. The timeline was intact. I had told myself that the November conversation was the worst of it, that I had recalibrated my expectations, that we were going to get through this with our dignity intact even if my parents contributed nothing. Then I got a call from the Grand Bellevue Hotel. The catering manager, a woman named Soledad Reyes who had been wonderful throughout the planning process, called me on a Tuesday afternoon in February to confirm a change to our reservation. She said she wanted to make sure I had the updated paperwork. I said, "What change?" There was a brief pause on her end. She said that she had received a call from a Gerald Ockafer who identified himself as the father of the bride and that he had requested to move the wedding to a different date in order to accommodate a scheduling conflict. I sat down very slowly. I said what date was requested. She told me the date. It was 3 weeks before our actual wedding. 3 weeks before every other vendor, every flight booked by every guest, every arrangement made by 112 people expecting a wedding in June. I said, "And was this change made?" She said not yet. They were waiting for confirmation from the primary reservation holder, which was me. I said, "Please do not make any changes to our reservation. None, under any circumstances, unless you hear from me personally. Not from my father, not from my mother, not from anyone else." From me, she said, "Of course, absolutely," and her voice had the careful neutrality of someone who has just understood that she is in the middle of a family situation. I hung up. I sat for a moment. Then I called Priya. Priya listened to the full account. Then she asked a question that I had not yet let myself ask out loud. Was it possible that my father had been attempting to cancel or substantially disrupt the wedding, not just move it, and the call to the venue was a first step? I said I did not know. She said, find out if he has made calls to any other vendors. I spent the next 4 days calling every vendor on my list: the florist, the photographer, the band, the transportation company, the hair and makeup team, the videographer, the cake baker, every single person whose contact information was in my wedding planning folder. 3 of them had received calls. The photographer, whose name was Brendan Ake, had received a call from a man identifying himself as my father, asking whether the contract could be released if the event was canceled due to a family emergency. The florist, whose name was Marta Irizarry, had received a similar call asking about the refund policy on deposits already paid. The transportation company had received a call asking what the cancellation penalty would be if they needed to release the vehicles. None of these vendors had made any changes. All of them had told the caller that any changes would need to come from the contract holder, which was me, but the pattern was unmistakable. My father had been quietly calling my vendors to assess the cost of canceling my wedding. I added every call log, every vendor account, every date and time I could document to my folder. I shared it with Priya that afternoon. She said in a voice that was very even and deliberate that she thought I needed to be prepared for the possibility that this was not over. I said I was already prepared. I want to tell you about the ally who made the difference, because no one does this alone, and I will not pretend otherwise. Her name is Josephine Nakamura. She is my business partner of 3 years, the co-director of Mensa Akafer Engineering Group, and she has been my closest friend since we were assigned to the same project team 8 years ago at the firm where we both worked before starting our own practice. Josephine is the kind of person who listens to everything before she speaks, who processes information with an almost architectural precision, and who, when she finally decides something is worth fighting for, brings a kind of focused ferocity that I have always admired. I told Josephine everything in March, sitting in her office after everyone else had gone home for the day. I told her about the November dinner, the vendor calls, Felicia's accounting, the full scope of what I had been quietly building in the folder I shared with Priya. I had not told her earlier because I was still hoping I would not need to use any of it. By March, I had stopped hoping that. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she pulled out a notepad and said, "Okay, what do you need from me?" I told her I needed someone to help me track logistics over the next 3 months. Someone I trusted absolutely. She was the only person who fit that description outside of Tobias, and I needed Tobias to be able to genuinely not know the full plan, because his natural tendency towards straightforward honesty would have made it difficult for him to maintain normal relations with my parents during the final months before the wedding. Josephine said, "Tell me everything you need." Over the next 6 weeks, Josephine helped me build what I started calling the contingency document. It was not a plan for revenge. That is important to understand. I did not sit down and design a punishment for my parents. What I did was build an honest accounting of damage, an invoice literally in the event that the worst happened. Priya was involved in this process. She reviewed every line. She verified that each number was documentable, that each claim was factually grounded, that nothing in the document was inflated or speculative. She was clear with me that I could not make the invoice legally binding in any traditional sense. A parent's promise to contribute to a wedding is not an enforceable contract under normal circumstances. But she said the invoice served another purpose. It was a statement. It was an accounting. It was evidence, if evidence was ever needed, of what had been done. The number we arrived at, working through every line with Priya's guidance, was $427,000. That figure breaks down as follows: $162,000 in non-refundable deposits and payments already made to vendors, $44,000 in additional vendor fees that would trigger upon a late cancellation, $30,000 representing the promised contribution that had been redirected. Travel and accommodation expenses already committed by out-of-town guests totaling approximately $89,000, which I included as a matter of record rather than as a primary claim, and $102,000 representing what Priya described as consequential costs, the financial impact of a canceled wedding on a couple's personal and professional reputation, the costs of rebooking if we chose to reschedule, and related damages. $427,000. I printed one copy and put it in an envelope. I gave a copy to Priya. I did not tell Tobias the exact number. I told him I had a contingency plan and that I hoped we would never need it. He said he trusted me. He said that so simply and so completely that I had to leave the room for a moment. April, 2 months before the wedding. The custody case had moved to trial, which meant that the financial pressure on my parents was at its highest point. Renata was calling them daily. I knew this because my mother, in a moment of exhaustion, told me on the phone that she was fielding calls from Renata every morning and that it was taking a toll. I said I was sorry to hear that. I asked if there was anything I could do. My mother said no, she thought they had things under control. I noted the date of that call in my document. I noted the phrase they had things under control. I noted that my mother sounded like someone who did not have things under control. In May, 1 month before the wedding, I had a conversation with my father that I want to tell you about carefully because it is the one that, in retrospect, I should have treated as the final warning. We were at my parents' house for Mother's Day. My father and I were standing in the backyard while my mother and Renata were inside. He asked me, in a tone that was trying to be casual and not entirely succeeding, whether Tobias and I had considered doing something smaller for the wedding. Whether we had thought about postponing, given everything the family was going through. I looked at him. I said, no, we haven't considered postponing. The wedding is 5 weeks away. Every deposit is paid. Every vendor is contracted. There is no scenario in which postponing saves anyone any money. He nodded. He said he understood. He said he just wanted to make sure we had thought it through. I said, Dad, is there something specific you are trying to tell me? He looked at the yard. He said no, he was just being a father. He just worried about us. I said, I appreciate that. We're fine. We're looking forward to the wedding. He nodded again. He did not look at me. I drove home from Mother's Day and I called Josephine and I said, I think it's going to happen. I think they're actually going to do something. She asked what I wanted to do. I said, I want to make sure the invoice is ready. I want to make sure Priya has everything she needs. And I want to make sure that when the moment comes, I am completely calm. Josephine said, you are going to be completely calm. I've never seen you be anything else when it mattered. I said, this one is going to test that. She said, I'll be there if you need me. In the last week of May, I discovered something that changed the shape of the story. I want to tell you exactly how it happened because the specifics matter. I had given my parents a copy of the wedding day timeline months earlier, the full schedule, vendor arrival times, the bridal suite booking at the Grand Bellevue, everything. Standard wedding planning communication. I had included it because my mother had asked for it, and I had no reason at that point to think it would be used against me. What I did not know until the last week of May was that my father had used that timeline, specifically the venue booking confirmation and the reservation number it contained, to call the hotel and represent himself as authorized to make changes. I found this out from Soledad Reyes, the catering manager. She called me to confirm our final headcount, and during that call mentioned that there had been another call from the same person as before, my father, this time asking whether the reservation could be released entirely if the primary holder sent written authorization. She said she had told him again that only the primary holder could authorize any changes, and she had followed up with an email to him explaining the policy. She offered to forward me a copy of that email. I said yes, please. The email arrived 20 minutes later. My father had written back to Soledad with a response that asked about the process for the primary holder to send written authorization. He was researching how to cancel my wedding without me knowing the cancellation was being requested. I read that email 3 times. Then I forwarded it to Priya with a single sentence, I need you to see this. She called me within the hour. She said, this changes things. She said, this is not a parent expressing concern or redirecting a promised contribution. This is an active attempt to interfere with contracts you hold. She said the hotel had been appropriately careful, but we needed to take steps immediately. That afternoon, Priya sent letters to every single vendor on my list on firm letterhead, formally notifying them that I, Zora Akafermensa, was the sole authorized party for all decisions regarding the wedding contracted under my name, that any communication from any other individual regarding changes, cancellations, or alterations to services should be documented and immediately reported to me, and that any changes made without my direct written authorization could expose the vendor to liability. Every vendor confirmed receipt. I called Brendan Ake, Marta Irizarry, and the transportation company directly to make sure they had the letter and understood it. They were all, without exception, cooperative and professional. Brendan Ake, the photographer, said that he had been getting an odd feeling about those earlier calls and that he was glad I was being proactive. I thanked him and told him I would see him on the wedding day. I filed copies of Priya's letters, the email chain from the hotel, and every other document I had gathered into the folder. I sat down with Felicia to confirm that the invoice numbers were current and accurate. She went through every line and confirmed them. The invoice was ready. The trap, if you want to call it that, though I think of it more as a prepared response than a trap, was set. What I needed now was patience. What I needed now was to not reveal a single thing before the moment of maximum visibility. What I needed was to walk into my wedding day in my ivory silk charmeuse dress with my white ranunculus bouquet, and 47 minutes before the ceremony, look my father in the eye and make him understand, with one piece of paper, the full cost of what he had chosen. The week before the wedding, I moved through my days with a strange calm that I think Tobias interpreted as wedding nerves, and that was actually something closer to the sensation a person gets when they are carrying something heavy over a long distance and can finally see the place where they are going to set it down. I finalized the invoice. Priya reviewed it one final time and made two small adjustments. The number remained $427,000. I printed 3 copies. I put one in my bag. I gave one to Josephine with instructions. I left one with Priya. I got my nails done. I confirmed the rehearsal dinner. I called my out-of-town guests to make sure they had everything they needed. I behaved in every visible way like a woman whose wedding was 6 days away and who was focused entirely on logistics. I was focused on logistics, just not entirely the logistics everyone assumed. On the Thursday before the wedding, my mother called to say she was so excited and that she could not believe her baby was getting married and that the whole family was going to be there and it was going to be beautiful. Her voice had the warm, slightly tearful quality of genuine maternal happiness, and I felt, listening to it, the specific ache of loving someone who's going to hurt you and knowing it and not being able to stop either thing. I told her I was excited too. I told her I loved her. I told her I would see her Saturday. I hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand. I thought about how strange it is to prepare for something you desperately wish you did not have to prepare for. How much simpler it would have been to simply get married. How much I would have preferred a version of that day where the only thing I needed to carry into the hotel was my bouquet. Then I put the phone down and I checked the folder one more time and I confirmed that every document was in order. The day before the wedding, I checked into the bridal suite at the Grand Bellevue with Josephine and my maid of honor, a woman named Delia Fortunato, who had been my closest friend since college and who was one of the people I had not told everything. Delia knew something was wrong. She knew my parents had been difficult. She did not know about the folder, the invoice, the vendor letters, Priya's involvement, or any of the specific preparation I had done. I had not told her because I love her and I did not want to burden her with it, and also because her face is spectacularly difficult to control when she knows something she is not supposed to show, and I needed everyone around me to appear genuinely normal. We ordered room service. We watched a movie. Delia painted her toenails. Josephine checked her phone more than I did, and I did not comment on it. At some point around 11 in the evening, I looked around the room at these two women who had shown up for me in every way a person can show up for another person, and I felt very clearly and without qualification that whatever happened the next day, I was not alone. That was the moment of genuine human connection that I want you to know about. Not the invoice, not the preparation, not the strategy. That room that night, those two women, and the specific, uncomplicated safety of being known by people who are on your side before you have done anything to earn it. I said out loud to both of them, "Whatever happens tomorrow, I'm really glad you're here." Delia looked up from her toenails. She said, "Of course we're here. Where else would we be?" Josephine looked at me over her phone. She said, "You're going to be great." Neither of them knew exactly what they were reassuring me about. Both of them meant it completely. I went to sleep at midnight. I woke up at 6:15. The dress was on the form in the corner of the room, ivory silk charmeuse catching the early light from the window. My flowers would arrive at 9. Tobias was across the city at his hotel with his best man, and he had texted me at midnight to say that he loved me and tomorrow was going to be the best day of his life. I read that text standing in the bathroom of the bridal suite, and I made myself a promise that I have kept. Whatever happened that day, I was going to give him the best version of myself I could manage, not the version that was braced for impact, the version that was genuinely, entirely present. Delia fastened the buttons up the back of my dress at 10:30, and I was holding my bouquet when my mother knocked on the door at 11:13, and her face, when I opened it, showed something I had not expected. She looked frightened, not the polite nervous of a mother on her daughter's wedding day, not the bittersweet of a parent watching their child begin a new chapter. Frightened the way a person looks when they are about to do something they know is wrong and they are going to do it anyway because they cannot see another way. She did not hug me immediately. She looked at me in my dress for a moment with her lips pressed together, and I saw her swallow. Then she reached out and put her hand on my arm and said, "Zora, your father is downstairs. He needs to talk to you." Behind me, I heard Delia go very still. I heard Josephine's phone screen lock. I said, "Right now." My mother said, "Yes, right now." I set my bouquet down on the dresser, very carefully so the ranunculus would not bruise. I picked up my bag. I looked at Josephine and she looked at me, and something passed between us that did not require words. I followed my mother to the elevator. My father was in the lobby. Renata was standing 8 feet away with her phone in her hand. My father was wearing his good suit, and he had the posture of someone who has done something irreversible and is trying to look like a man who made a decision rather than a man who made a mistake. He said, "Zora." He said he needed to tell me something. The lobby of the Grand Bellevue was not empty. There were hotel staff moving through it. There were guests from our wedding beginning to arrive. I could see a few people in formal wear near the entrance, people who had traveled from Atlanta and Chicago and London for this day. I could see them in my peripheral vision. So could my father. He said that he had made a call to the hotel the previous week. He said that he had requested to release the reservation. He stopped. He swallowed. He said that Soledad Reyes had informed him that morning that his request had not been processed because the authorization had not come from me, but that the wedding arrangements were still fully intact. He looked at his hands. He said, Renata's case is going to trial next week. The attorney needs the rest of the retainer by Monday. We don't have it. We've already given everything we had and it isn't enough and she needs us, and he stopped. I waited. He said, I thought if the venue released the deposit, we could use it toward the retainer. I know that was wrong, but we didn't know what else to do. My mother had come to stand beside him. She put her hand on his arm. She said, We're so sorry. We know this was wrong, but Renata needs us. Her daughters need us. We hope you understand. You've always been the strong one. You can manage this. Renata can't. I looked at my mother. I looked at my father. I looked at Renata 15 feet away, who was holding her phone and not looking at me. Then I reached into my bag. The envelope was cream-colored, heavyweight, the kind Priya used for formal correspondence. I had addressed it to Gerald and Diane Acaffer. I had printed both their names, their address, and in the upper left corner the name of my firm. I held it out to my father. He took it with the reflexive courtesy of someone who has not yet processed that the envelope is the consequence. I said, You can pay me back or we can let the attorneys sort it out, but I want you to understand the number before you decide. He opened the envelope. He pulled out the invoice. He looked at the top line. He looked at the total at the bottom. He opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. $427,000. Written out in full in Priya's careful formatting, line by line. My mother leaned over to look at the paper. Her hand tightened on my father's arm. From across the lobby, I heard the sound of the ballroom doors opening for the final setup. I heard the band beginning their sound check, faint and bright, something with strings. I heard the heels of early arriving guests on the marble floor behind me. I picked up my bouquet from where I had set it on the lobby table. I said, If you'll excuse me, I have a wedding to attend. And I walked back toward the elevator because what happened next is the reason I am still telling this story. And if you're still with me, stay, because the next 47 minutes were the ones that changed everything about how this day ended. The elevator doors closed behind me and Delia grabbed my arm. Her fingers wrapped around my wrist with the particular grip of a person who has just witnessed something they do not have the full context for and is trying not to spiral. She said, Zora, what was that? What was in that envelope? I looked at my reflection in the mirrored elevator doors. My dress was perfect. My veil was straight. The ranunculus in my bouquet had not lost a single petal. I said, An invoice. She stared at me in the mirror. She said, An invoice for what? I said, For the wedding they tried to cancel. The elevator opened on our floor. Josephine was standing in the hallway outside the bridal suite with her phone face down against her thigh, which was her version of theatrical patience. She had been waiting for me. She had known, within a 90-second window, exactly how long this would take. She looked at my face, and then she looked at Delia's face, and then she opened the door. Inside the suite, the three of us stood in a triangle of morning light, and I told them both, in the quietest possible voice, that my father had confirmed he had attempted to release the hotel reservation, and that I had handed him the invoice in the lobby in front of arriving guests, in front of hotel staff, in front of Renata, and that I did not yet know what he was going to do next. Delia sat down on the edge of the bed. She put both hands over her face. She said, muffled, Are you telling me this is actually happening? I said, Yes. She took her hands away from her face. She said, And you've been planning this for how long? Josephine said, 14 months. Delia looked at Josephine. She looked at me. She said, And neither of you told me. I said, I needed you to be genuinely you today. I needed your real face. If you had known, you would have spent every family interaction for 14 months being a worse actress than you are a friend, and it would have given everything away. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, That is both the most manipulative and most loving thing anyone has ever said to me. I said, I know, I'm sorry, and I need you to get me to the ceremony. She stood up. She straightened her bridesmaid dress. She picked up her flowers. She said, Let's go get you married. That was what I needed. Not strategy, not documentation, not the careful architecture of a plan 14 months in the making. Just Delia Fortunato standing up with her shoulders back saying, Let's go get you married. I had approximately 40 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. My father had the invoice. My mother had seen his face reading it. Renata was somewhere in that hotel with her phone in her hand, which meant the family group chain was already on fire. But here is what I knew that they did not. I had called Soledad Reyes the previous morning and confirmed in writing that the hotel would not take any instruction from any party other than me regarding the wedding. I had paid every remaining balance directly from my firm account the week before, removing any outstanding financial leverage entirely. I had notified Priya Sunderland at 6 that morning with a single text that said today is the day, and she had responded with a single word, ready. The ceremony would happen. The only question was whether my parents would be in the room when it did. I let Delia repin one small piece of my veil that had shifted in the elevator. Josephine checked her phone and told me that Tobias's best man, a quiet man named Rafael Osai, who I had always liked for his absolute economy of emotion, had confirmed that Tobias was at the venue entrance and did not know anything had happened. I had asked Josephine to keep Tobias entirely clear of the morning's events. He would learn everything, just not until after we were married, when the telling would be a story rather than a crisis. I walked down the corridor toward the ceremony room with my bouquet in my hands and my invoice in my father's hands and 83 people waiting, and for the second time that morning, I felt the particular clarity that comes from having prepared so completely for a thing that the thing itself becomes almost simple. The ceremony was beautiful. I want to say that clearly and without qualification. Tobias Mensa standing at the end of that aisle with his hands clasped in front of him and his eyes doing something complicated and overwhelmed. The band playing something low and string forward that we had chosen together, Delia in front of me and Josephine behind me, and the room full of people who had traveled from 4 states and 1 country to be there. All of it was exactly what I had planned and hoped for, and the fact that my parents were seated in the front row with my father holding a folded piece of paper in his jacket pocket and my mother's hands clasped too tightly in her lap did not diminish any of it. I did not look at my father's face when I walked past. I looked at Tobias. We were married by 2 in the afternoon. The reception began at 4. And somewhere between the ceremony and the cocktail hour, my father asked one of the hotel staff to tell me he needed to speak with me. I sent back a message through the same staff member. After the reception, if he wanted to talk, we could talk. Not before, not during. This was my wedding day and it would be treated as such. He did not approach me again until 6:47 that evening. That is where the false submission begins, and I want to be very precise about what happened because the precision matters. At 6:47, during the dinner portion of the reception while the band was on their break, my father appeared at my table. He had clearly been composing himself for some time. His jacket was buttoned. His expression had the careful flatness of a man who has decided on an approach. He said, "Could we find somewhere quiet?" Tobias looked at me. I had given him the broad strokes during cocktail hour, 3 sentences, enough for him to understand the shape of the day without the full technical detail. He pressed his hand to the small of my back and said, "Take as long as you need. I'll be here." I followed my father to a small meeting room off the hotel corridor, the kind of room with a round table and 4 chairs that exists for exactly this purpose, for the conversations that cannot happen in public. My mother was there. Renata was there. And a man I did not immediately recognize who turned out to be Renata's attorney, a person named Gordon Chu who had driven an hour and a half to be at my wedding reception, which told me that my family had spent some part of my wedding day in telephone consultation with legal counsel. That detail told me everything I needed to know about what they thought this meeting was. Gordon Chu was a compact man in a gray suit who had the particular demeanor of an attorney who has been hired to clean up a situation he did not create. He introduced himself with a handshake and told me he was there in an advisory capacity only, that this was a family matter and he was simply there to help facilitate a resolution. I said, "That's very thoughtful. Who invited you?" My mother said, "Zora, please." Gordon Chu set a folder on the table. He opened it. He said that he had reviewed the invoice I had provided, and that while he understood it represented real costs and real frustration, the legal basis for the amounts claimed was, in his professional opinion, limited. He said that verbal commitments from parents regarding wedding costs generally did not constitute enforceable contracts. He said the non-refundable vendor deposits were real, but the other items, particularly the consequential damages, would face significant challenge in any proceeding. He said all of this in the smooth, practiced tone of a man who expects the person across from him to be intimidated by the word proceeding. I let a beat of silence go by. Then I said, "I appreciate your analysis. My attorney's analysis is somewhat different, but I'm sure 2 reasonable attorneys can disagree." My father leaned forward. He said, "Zora, we don't want this to become a legal matter. We want to resolve this as a family. We're your parents. Renata is your sister. Her daughters are your nieces. We're asking you to understand the position we were in." I said, "Tell me about the position you were in." He said that Renata's case was desperate, that the custody trial was scheduled for the following week, that without additional funds her attorney would not be able to prepare adequately, that the consequences for his granddaughters could be severe and lasting. My mother said we did not have a choice. When your child needs you, you go to them. I looked at my mother. I kept my voice very even. I said, "I am also your child." She looked at the table. That was the one moment all evening when I saw something real move across her face. Not guilt exactly, something older and more complicated, the look of a person who knows they have arranged their heart in a particular way for so long that they no longer fully know how to rearrange it. Gordon Chu said, "We'd like to propose a payment arrangement. Given the family's current financial position, they can commit to repaying the documented vendor costs in installments over 36 months. The total would be $106,000, which represents the verifiable non-refundable amounts. $106,000 out of $427,000 over 36 months. I let my expression shift. I let my lips press together. I let my hands go still on the table. I watched my father watch me. He said, "Zora, we know this isn't what you wanted, but this is what we can do. We're your family. We need you to meet us here." Renata spoke for the first time. Her voice was quiet and she was looking at the table and she said, "I'm sorry, Zora. I know this isn't fair, but my girls need me. I need you to help me. I'm asking you as your sister." I looked at her. I let my eyes go soft. I let my breath out slowly. I put one hand flat on the table. Then I said, "All right." Gordon Chu's pen moved. I said, "I'll accept the payment arrangement. I'll need it documented in writing tonight before we leave the hotel." Gordon Chu nodded. He was already writing. I said, "I'll also need the document to include a clause confirming that Gerald and Diane Akafer acknowledge making the vendor inquiry calls I've described, and that they agree not to make any further contact with my vendors or interfere with any professional commitments I hold." My father's pen stopped. Gordon Chu looked up. I kept my expression entirely neutral. I said, "That's a standard non-interference clause. Given what happened this week with the hotel reservation, I think it's reasonable to have it in writing." Gordon Chu looked at my father. My father looked at my mother. My mother was looking at me with an expression that had shifted slightly, a small recalibration, the way a person looks when they have just noticed something they missed before. Gordon Chu said, "That's an unusual addition to a payment arrangement." I said, "It's a non-negotiable one." There was a silence. My father pulled at his collar. Renata looked at her phone under the table, which she always did when she was nervous and did not want anyone to know she was nervous. My father said, "Fine, if that's what you need." I let my shoulders come down a fraction. I let my voice soften by precisely the right amount. I said, "Thank you. I appreciate you working with me on this." I watched Gordon Chu draft the document longhand. I watched my father sign it. I watched my mother sign it. The document acknowledged the payment arrangement of $106,000 over 36 months, confirmed the non-interference clause regarding my professional and contractual relationships, and included, because Gordon Chu was a thorough attorney even when working against my interests, a full description of the events that had necessitated the agreement. What Gordon Chu did not know, because nobody in that room except me knew it, was that Priya Sunderland had spent the previous week quietly preparing a separate legal filing. It was not about the invoice. It was about something specific that Felicia Tamura had found in her accounting review in January, something I had not yet revealed to anyone outside of Priya and Josephine. My parents had been co-signers on a joint account that Tobias and I had opened with them 2 years earlier for the specific purpose of holding wedding funds. It was a practical arrangement from a period when I still trusted the promises being made to me. Over 12 months, I had deposited $68,000 of my own money into that account toward wedding costs. The account had been set up with my parents as co-signers because at the time we had anticipated their contribution flowing through it. In March, 6 weeks before the wedding, my father had transferred $41,000 out of that account without my knowledge or consent. $41,000 gone to a routing number that Felicia had traced with some effort to a personal account used for Renata's legal fees. That was not a redirected promise. That was not a difficult family decision made under pressure. That was money that was mine in an account with my name on it, taken without my knowledge to fund my sister's attorney. Gordon Chu's document, the one my father had just signed, did not mention this. It described only the vendor deposits and the hotel situation. My father had signed it believing it was the resolution. He had signed it believing that $106,000 over 36 months was the end of the matter. I folded the document and put it in my bag. I thanked Gordon Chu. I said goodnight to my parents and to Renata. I walked back into my wedding reception. I found Tobias at our table with his jacket off and his tie loosened, talking to Raphael, and I sat down beside him and he took my hand. He said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I will be. I need to call Priya in the morning." He said, "Whatever you need." I looked around the room. The band had started again. The dance floor had people on it. Josephine was talking to my aunt. Delia was laughing at something one of the groomsmen had said. The ranunculus centerpieces were exactly as Marta Irizarry had designed them, and the light in the room was warm and low, and I had married the right person that morning in front of every person who mattered to me. My father thought he had settled the matter. He thought $106,000 in installments and a non-interference clause and an attorney's handwritten document was the end. The papers were signed. The trap was set. I had exactly 72 hours before Priya would file. Monday morning arrived the way consequential mornings do, quietly without announcement, with the ordinary sound of coffee being made and a phone on the nightstand showing 17 unread messages. Tobias and I were supposed to leave for our honeymoon on Wednesday, a 10-day trip we had planned for 2 years. I had every intention of being on that plane, but first, I called Priya at 8:30 in the morning from the kitchen of our apartment while Tobias was in the shower. She answered on the second ring. I told her about the meeting with Gordon Chu, the document my father had signed, the acknowledgement clause, the payment arrangement. She was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she said he signed an acknowledgement document prepared by his daughter's attorney confirming the events surrounding the canceled reservation. I said he signed a document prepared by his own attorney. I did not write it. Gordon Chu wrote it. My father reviewed it and signed it. There was a pause. Then Priya said, Zora, that's actually better. I said, I know. She said, and you still want to proceed with the filing. I said he took $41,000 from a joint account. That is not a family misunderstanding. That is a specific, documentable act with a specific routing number and a specific date. I want to proceed. She said, all right, I'll file today. The legal filing Priya submitted that Monday morning was not the invoice. The invoice had always been a statement, a declaration of costs, and a record of what had happened. What Priya filed was a formal civil claim for the $41,000 removed from our joint wedding fund account without my authorization. The claim named my father specifically. It cited the bank records Felicia had documented. It cited the routing information tracing the transfer to Renata's legal fund. It cited the signed acknowledgement document from my wedding night as corroborating evidence of a broader pattern of interference with my financial affairs. Priya served my father on Tuesday afternoon. I want to tell you what happened next because it did not happen in a private meeting room with an attorney taking notes. It happened in the living room of my parents' house the following Saturday, in front of 12 people who had gathered for what my mother had organized as a family lunch to, in her words, help everyone process and move forward. My mother did not know about the filing when she organized the lunch. She found out Friday evening after my father was served, and she called me in a state of distress that I will not describe in detail because some of what she said in those calls was the kind of raw maternal hurt that does not belong in a public telling. I will only say that she asked me to come to the lunch. She said she thought it would help if everyone could talk. I told her I would come. Josephine asked me on Friday night if I was sure. I said yes. She said, did I want her there? I said yes. She arrived Saturday morning in a gray blazer that I recognized as the one she wore when she was going to be in a room that required her to be both professional and prepared to be underestimated. She brought a bag that contained, among other things, a folder with printed copies of every document relevant to the $41,000 claim, a printed copy of the signed acknowledgement from my wedding night, and a printed copy of Felicia's full financial accounting going back 2 years. We drove to my parents' house together. The day was cool and bright, the kind of Saturday that usually made my mother's neighborhood look like a pleasant place to grow up in. I had grown up in it. I knew its specific pleasures and its specific omissions. There were cars in the driveway I recognized and 2 I did not. My parents had, it appeared, gathered not just immediate family but also my mother's sister, my father's brother and his wife, and 2 family friends who were old enough to remember my childhood and who my parents had always treated as something close to adjunct relatives. 12 people total, as my mother had said. In a room that expected to mediate, I was walking in with a civil claim and a folder. We went inside. The living room was arranged with additional chairs. Someone had put out food. My mother had made her groundnut soup again, which I think was an attempt at comfort through familiarity. She hugged me at the door with a grip that was tight and a little desperate, and I let her hold on for a moment before I stepped back. My father was across the room. He looked like a man who had not slept well since Tuesday. He looked at me when I came in, and something moved in his expression that I could not entirely name, not quite remorse, not quite defiance. The specific look of a person who has done something that made sense from inside their own priorities and is beginning to understand how it looks from outside. Renata was on the sofa. Her daughters were not there, which was a relief. I had been concerned about that. This was not a room for children. Gordon Chu was not present. I noted that. Josephine sat in a chair near the door. She put her bag between her feet. She said good morning to the room with the particular warmth of someone who is not here to make enemies. My father's brother, whose name is Edmund Acaffer and who is a retired school principal with the bearing of a man who has managed large groups of people for 30 years, looked between me and my father and said, I think we should talk. My father said yes. He said he wanted to start by saying he was sorry for what had happened at the wedding, that the timing was wrong and the method was wrong, that he had been under enormous pressure and had made decisions he regretted. He said he regretted the reservation call. He said he should not have done that. He said he hoped we could find a way forward as a family without the legal process. I said, I appreciate that. I want to ask you about something specific, and I want you to answer me honestly in front of everyone here. The room went the particular quiet of people trying to seem like they are not paying close attention while paying extremely close attention. My mother's hands went to the edge of her chair. She gripped it. I said in March, $41,000 was transferred from the joint wedding fund account that Tobias and I held with you as co-signers. I want to know if you authorized that transfer. My father looked at me for 2 full seconds without blinking. The color started to drain from the middle of his face, leaving the edges oddly bright. He said, Zora, I said, I have the bank records, I have the transfer documentation, I have the routing number and the destination account. I'm asking you to tell me in front of our family whether you authorized that transfer. Edmund cleared his throat. He said, Gerald, you should answer her. My father's hand went to his jacket pocket. He pulled at something that was not there, then let his hand fall. He said, he stopped. He closed his mouth. He opened it again. Said, I thought I was going to replace it. Before the wedding, I was going to replace it. A sound from my mother's direction, not words, just a small involuntary exhale. My aunt, my mother's sister, whose name is Falik Adami and who has always been the most direct person in any room she enters, said, Gerald, you took money from her account. My father said I had co-signing rights. I thought. Falik said, co-signing rights mean you can help manage the account. They don't mean you can take her money. My father said, I know that. I was going to put it back. I opened my bag. I took out the folder. I placed it on the coffee table between us. I did not open it yet. I said, I want to walk through what happened from the beginning so everyone in this room understands the full picture. Renata shifted on the sofa. She put her phone down, which was so unusual that two people looked at her when she did it. I said 14 months ago, my parents promised $30,000 toward my wedding. I budgeted and planned in reliance on that promise. I signed contracts with vendors totaling over $200,000. During that same period, my parents directed approximately $143,000 toward Renata's custody proceedings without informing me that the promised contribution would be affected. I found this out third hand at a family barbecue. I opened the folder. I placed the first document on the table. It was Felicia's accounting summary, a clean single-page breakdown of every dollar tracked. The numbers on it were organized by date and by recipient. I said, this is the documented accounting of funds directed toward Renata's case over the same period. Edmund leaned forward. He looked at the numbers. He did not say anything, but his reading glasses came out of his pocket without him appearing to make a decision about them. I said in March, rather than informing me that the $30,000 was being permanently redirected, my father used co-signing access to our joint account to transfer $41,000 to a routing number associated with Renata's attorney. This was money I had deposited specifically for wedding costs. I placed the second document on the table, bank records, the transfer amount, the date, the routing number. My father looked at the document. He looked at the amount. He looked at the date. He said, Zora, I was trying to protect my grandchildren. I said, I know, I believe that completely. But the method you used was to take money from my account without my knowledge or consent and use it for someone else's legal fees. That is not a difficult family decision. That is a specific act with a specific legal name. My mother said, Zora, please, he's your father. He made a mistake. We're asking you. I said, Mom, I love you. I need you to let me finish. She stopped. That might be the first time in my adult life I had said those words to her and had them land properly. The first time she had heard them as a request rather than a challenge. She sat back in her chair. I said, on my wedding day, my father went to the hotel and confirmed to me in the lobby in front of arriving guests and hotel staff that he had attempted to release the venue reservation in order to use the deposit toward Renata's attorney retainer. I placed the third document on the table. The email chain from Soledad Reyes, the catering manager, documenting my father's calls to the hotel. Dates, times, the exact language of his inquiry. Someone behind me, I think it was my father's brother's wife, made a quiet sound. I placed the fourth document on the table. The acknowledgement signed in the meeting room at my wedding reception, prepared by Gordon Chu, my father's own attorney, in which Gerald and Diane Ockhaffer confirmed the events I had described. Edmund looked at the acknowledgement. He looked at my father. He said, Gerald, you signed this. My father said, I thought it was a payment arrangement. I didn't. Gordon Chu wrote it, I said. I didn't write it. Your attorney wrote it based on your account of what happened, and you reviewed it and signed it. The document you signed says that you made calls to my vendors inquiring about cancellation terms. My father looked at the document with the expression of a man who has just understood that the thing he believed was a contained cleanup was not contained at all. His hand went to the arm of his chair. He gripped it. He said, Zora, I never wanted it to go this far. You have to believe that. I said, I believe you never wanted it to go this far. I think you made a series of decisions that seemed manageable at each individual step, and you didn't look at the cumulative picture until now. But I need you to look at it now, in front of our family, so that everyone here understands what I am asking to be made right. Renata made a sound. It was not a word. I looked at her. She was looking at the documents on the coffee table with an expression that was genuinely complicated, the expression of someone watching their own situation reflected back at them in a way they did not expect. She said, I didn't know about the account, about the transfer. I knew they were helping me. I didn't know how. I said, I know. She looked up at me. She said, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Zora. I looked at my sister for a long moment. She looked like someone who had been standing on a floor she believed was solid and had just discovered it was someone else's property. She looked genuinely sorry. Not for the first time I was aware of the particular tragedy of a person who causes damage not from malice but from a lifelong certainty that the world arranges itself around their needs. She had not stolen from me. She had not called the vendors. She had not transferred the money. But she had accepted the benefits of all of it without asking questions, and some part of her had always known that the questions had answers she did not want. I said, I know, I believe you. She put her hands over her face. She did not make a sound. Edmund said, Gerald, what do you intend to do? My father looked at the table. He looked at my mother. She would not look back at him. That was the moment, the specific moment I watched happen in real time, when she stopped being his ally in the room and became simply his wife. She was not going to take his side on this. She had taken his side on too many things, and this was the one that had broken something in her. My father said, I want to make it right. I want to pay back everything. I know what I did was wrong. I thought I was doing the right thing for the family, and I know now that it wasn't. His voice broke on the last word. Not dramatically, just a small fracture at the end of the sentence, the sound of a man who has run out of the particular certainty that had sustained him. I said the civil filing covers $41,000. That is the amount that was taken from our joint account without authorization. If you transfer that amount directly to my account within 30 days, Priya will file a notice of voluntary dismissal. He said, I can do that. I said, I also need the payment arrangement from Wednesday to be honored. $106,000 over 36 months as Gordon Chu documented it. He said, yes, we'll honor it. I said, and I need something that is not on any document and cannot be put on any document. I need you to understand fully and clearly that what you did to me was not a difficult family decision. It was a betrayal. It was a specific betrayal of a specific person who had trusted you, and I need you to know that I am not going to pretend otherwise going forward. I am not going to be fine about this. I am done being fine. The room was completely still. Someone's phone buzzed, and the person holding it turned it over without looking at it. My father looked at me. His eyes were wet, which was something I had seen exactly twice in my life before that moment, once when his own father died and once when Renata was in the hospital for 3 days when she was 19. He said, I know, you're right, I'm sorry, I am so sorry, Zora. My mother said, we are so sorry, both of us. We should have done better, we should have been better. Falik said quietly from across the room, yes, you should have. Nobody argued with her. The lunch was served. People ate. Edmund stayed after most of the others left and talked with my father for an hour in the backyard. I sat with my mother at the kitchen table and we drank tea, and she cried quietly for a while, and I let her, because she was my mother and she was genuinely sorry, and genuine sorrow deserves to be witnessed even when it is the sorrow of someone who hurt you. She said, I always thought you were the strong one. I thought that meant you didn't need us the same way. I said, strong doesn't mean I don't need things. It just means I'm good at managing when I don't get them. She looked at her teacup. She said, I didn't know that. I should have known that. I said, yes. She said, can we come back from this? I thought about that question for a long time, long enough that she looked up to see if I was going to answer at all. I said, I don't know yet. I think we can. I think it depends on whether this is the moment you've both decided to see me clearly, or whether it's a moment that passes and then goes back to what it was. I can't tell that from a Saturday afternoon. It takes time to tell that. She nodded. She said, we'll try. I said, then I'll give you the chance. Tobias and I left for our honeymoon on Wednesday. 10 days in Portugal, a trip we had planned for 2 years, in a country neither of us had been to before, full of light and the smell of the Atlantic and streets that went uphill in unexpected directions. We ate fish on outdoor terraces and drank wine that cost $14 a bottle and was some of the best wine I have ever had. We walked until our feet hurt, and then we walked further. We did not talk about my parents or the civil filing or the documents in the folder or any of it for the first 4 days, because 4 days is the correct amount of time to give a thing that size before it is allowed back into a regular conversation. On the 5th day, sitting on a terrace watching the water, Tobias said, tell me everything, from the beginning. I told him from the beginning, all of it. The barbecue in August where Constance mentioned the 62,000, the call to Priya, the November dinner, the vendor calls, the email from the hotel, Felicia's accounting, the invoice, the folder, Gordon Chu in the meeting room on my wedding night, drafting a document that confirmed everything I would later use in a civil filing. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 14 months. I said, 14 months. He said, you carried all of that for 14 months. I said, I was building something. I needed the architecture to be complete before I could use it. He said, I know, that's who you are. He paused. He said, I just want you to know that you also could have told me. I would have helped you carry it. I said, I know, I'm sorry I didn't. He picked up his wine glass. He said, next time, and I hope there's no next time, but next time tell me earlier. I said, deal. We finished the wine and watched a fishing boat moving in the distance. I thought about what I had said to my mother. Strong doesn't mean I don't need things. I thought about the 14 months of silence and documentation and strategic patience, and the folder and Priya and Josephine and Delia saying, let's go get you married. I thought about the $41,000 that would be back in my account before the month was out. I thought about my father's voice breaking on the word wrong. I thought about what it costs to be the one who's always fine and what it costs to stop. The $41,000 transfer arrived 26 days later. My father paid it in full, as he had said he would, without requiring any legal enforcement beyond the initial filing. The civil claim was dismissed the same week. Priya sent me a clean summary of the resolution and a final invoice for her services, which I paid with the particular satisfaction of money well spent. The monthly payments on the $106,000 arrangement began 60 days after my wedding and have been made consistently since. I do not count on them as income. I deposit them when they arrive, and I do not think about them much. The accounting is secondary to what I actually needed, which was the acknowledgement. My father lost something that Saturday afternoon in the living room, not with me exactly, but with Edmund, with Folake, with the family friends who were present, with several people in his social world who heard eventually what had happened and who adjusted their understanding of him accordingly. He has never told me directly how that has felt. But I have noticed that he moves more carefully in family spaces now, with a diffidence that was not there before, the diffidence of a person who has had their confidence in their own rightness corrected publicly and has had to decide how to live after that. My mother and I talk every other week. We are building something. It is slower and more careful than what we had before, but what we had before was built on my willingness to be fine at all costs, and that willingness is gone now. What we are building instead has sturdier foundations, I think. We talk about real things. She asks how I actually am and waits for actual answers. It is not perfect. It may never be perfect, but it is honest, which is something. Renata's custody case settled out of court 3 months after the wedding. She retained shared custody of her daughters. I do not know the full terms. I know that she called me the week the settlement was signed and said that she was glad it was over, and I said I was glad too, and I meant it. Her daughters are children who I love independently of everything else. Whatever happens between the adults in this family, they are not its casualties if I can help it. Josephine and I expanded Mensaka for engineering group this year. We brought on 2 additional engineers and won a municipal contract that represents our largest single project to date. The firm's revenue this year will clear $2.7 million. I work in an office on the 9th floor of a building I could not have afforded 6 years ago, and sometimes in the early morning, when I am the first one and I stand at the window and look at the city and think about all the architecture beneath the surface of things, all the structural load-bearing work that happens invisibly so that what stands above can hold. Tobias makes coffee in the mornings in our apartment, the one we moved into after the wedding, in a neighborhood we chose together. The apartment has good light. The kitchen table is the one we bought secondhand 2 years before we were married and had been saving for a real apartment. We sat at it on Sunday evenings for 2 years eating takeout and planning the wedding and talking about the future. And now we sit at it in the mornings with actual coffee, and it is ours and the future is, incrementally and undramatically and completely, here. I do not hate my family. I want to say that clearly. I do not hate my parents. I do not even resent Renata, not anymore, not in the hot and ongoing way of it. What I have instead is an accurate understanding of what each of those relationships is and is not, and what I can and cannot carry into them without losing something essential about myself. That understanding cost me 14 months of careful and visible work and one morning in a hotel lobby in an ivory dress with an envelope in my hand. I would do it again, not because the money mattered most. The money was the measure. It was the concrete, specific language through which I could say, this is what you took. This is what it cost. This is the number that represents the gap between your promises and your actions. The money was the invoice. What the invoice was really for was my dignity, and the return on that investment has no figure I can put in a spreadsheet. My name is Zora Akafermensa. I was the fine one, the strong one, the one who could manage. I carried that assigned role for 38 years, and I set it down on a hotel lobby floor on my wedding day, and I have not picked it back up. You do not have to wait until someone cancels your wedding to do the same. You do not have to have a folder or an attorney or 14 months of preparation. What you need is the willingness to stop accepting less than what you were promised, in whatever form that promise came and whatever form that refusal needs to take. Your invoice is already written. You just have to decide it's time to hand it over. If this story reached something in you today, please like it and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below. Drop the word ready if you are done being the fine one. I read every one of them, and I want to know you are out there.